She was told to stay in her lane. Instead, she walked straight into the fire with a folder, a cross, and the truth. What happens when a young press secretary challenges a four-star general and refuses to back down? This isn't just a political standoff, it's a question we all need to ask. Who's really calling the shots? Stay with us, because what Karoline Leavitt uncovered was never meant to be seen. It was just after 8 a.m. when the early sunlight spilled across the south lawn of the White House. Karoline Leavitt stood at the tall windows of the West Wing, reviewing her notes with a kind of sharp, methodical calm that had become her signature. Her press briefing was scheduled for 10 a.m., and the room was already buzzing with anticipation. Today's topics weren't exactly light: a sweeping education reform proposal, a rising cyber threat index, and questions about the president's new oversight task force. But Karoline was ready. She always was. Her silver cross necklace glinted against her navy blue blazer as she paced the corridor near the Roosevelt Room, rehearsing her answers in her mind. Then her personal phone buzzed an unknown number. She almost ignored it. White House protocol strongly discouraged answering personal calls during official prep, but something about the number, the timing, stopped her. With a quiet breath, she tapped accept. "Miss Leavitt." The voice was deep, gravelly, controlled. "This is General Mark Milley." Karoline froze mid-step. The retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs wasn't just a household name. He was a symbol of the old guard, and he hadn't called to chat. "Yes, General," she answered calmly, motioning for her aide to pause down the hallway. "I'll be brief," Milley said. "There's a classified program, Project Sandgate. The cyber operations you're referencing in today's press remarks are part of it." Karoline didn't respond immediately. She hadn't mentioned Sandgate by name in any public notes, but she had planned to reference a pattern of digital incursions from Baltic-based networks, something her internal research team had flagged as connected to U.S. defense initiatives. "General," she said, voice steady, "my briefing doesn't touch on any classified material. All data is cleared through the Presidential Communications Office. There are things they don't tell even you." Milley cut in. "I'm giving you a heads up. Don't mention Sandgate, not directly, not obliquely. Drop the subject entirely." There was a beat of silence. Karoline's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you issuing a warning?" "No," he said flatly. "I'm protecting you. You're very visible and very young. You're being watched by more than just a press pool." Her jaw clenched. "I've handled pressure before, General." "I'm not talking about pressure," Milley replied. "I'm talking about your career and its sudden interruption." There was clear, unmistakable a line drawn in the quiet space between loyalty and fear. Then the call ended. No goodbye, just the cold finality of power asserting itself. Karoline stared at her screen. The call duration blinked. 1 minute, 53 seconds. Her aide approached. "Ma'am, the briefing room is ready." She nodded once, slipping the phone into her jacket pocket, but something in the air had shifted, not visibly, not loudly, but beneath her polished exterior. A spark had caught. Back in her West Wing office, Karoline closed the blinds and opened a secure browser. Her clearance wasn't deep enough to access Project Sandgate directly, but she knew where to start. A redacted memo from 6 months ago mentioned perimeter disruption advisories tied to Scandinavian monitoring notes. She'd skimmed it before, but today it read differently. Project Sandgate wasn't just cyber surveillance, it was command-linked, bypassing standard NSC vetting and involving cooperation with foreign military networks outside formal treaties. And Milley knew she was getting too close. Her mind raced. This wasn't about military policy, it was about power, about someone who no longer held official authority, still trying to pull strings. Behind closed doors, Karoline stood, pulled her blazer tighter, and looked out over the White House lawn. She had entered politics to speak truth, not to be managed like a junior operative. If General Milley wanted silence, he had miscalculated, because she wasn't backing down. She was stepping forward, and she would do it where the whole country could see. She didn't say a word about the call that day, not during the press briefing, not during the follow-up with reporters, not even when her communications director asked if everything was okay. Because it wasn't. And Karoline Leavitt didn't believe in giving away leverage before she understood the battlefield. That night, long after the West Wing had emptied and the lights inside the briefing room had dimmed, Karoline walked across the darkened courtyard toward the old executive office building. The halls were quiet, save for the occasional echo of a janitor's cart rolling over marble floors. She swiped her badge twice, first to access the secure wing, then again for the archive room where former briefings and correspondences were stored. She wasn't looking for scandal. She was looking for proof. Sitting alone under the pale fluorescent glow, Karoline powered up her secure laptop and began reviewing everything she could access. From her predecessor, Madison Keene, who had stepped down suddenly 3 months prior, citing family obligations. Karoline had always found the resignation abrupt, but in Washington, few exits came without some sort of smoke. Now, she knew where to look. In an old email chain marked internal clearance and distributable, she found it. Project Sandgate. The name appeared only twice, once in a briefing marked shelved, executive override, and again in an encrypted summary referencing remote NATO synchronization trials. Her pulse quickened. She clicked into the metadata. The memo was dated for months after the president had ordered Sandgate paused, pending internal legal review. But this document described progress updates being sent not to the White House but to a liaison team in Oslo. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. She checked the sender, not military, but a civilian assistant to the Joint Chiefs, the recipient, Foreign Defense Attaches. None of this had gone through standard White House protocol. She sat back, letting the weight of it settle. Milley hadn't just warned her off something sensitive. He was involved in something quietly ongoing well outside his current authority. But it didn't stop there. Digging deeper, she found recorded transcriptions of internal call summaries involving Milley and a multinational commander network based in Poland and Norway. The dates matched a quiet period in the press calendar, when Karoline remembered being abruptly pulled from an interagency meeting with no explanation. They weren't hiding this from the public. They were hiding it from the White House. As the clock crept past midnight, Karoline rubbed her eyes and reached for her insulated mug. Cold coffee, no surprise. She took a sip anyway. Then a new email notification blinked onto her screen. It wasn't from a known sender. Proton at keystone-secure.com. Subject: "You're not supposed to see this." Her heart stopped for a beat. There was no message body, just a single attachment. Audio for _km.wav. She looked around the room, though she knew no one else was there. Her fingers hovered, hesitated, then clicked. A voice crackled the life through her headphones, faint, slightly distorted, but unmistakable. "Milley, they flagged her. She's getting close to the Sandgate funnel. We need to reroute internal access codes or freeze her visibility entirely." "I don't care what comms office thinks, just lock it down," another voice responded, garbled. "Probably a staffer." Then Milley again. "She's smart, but she's still a rookie. Play the loyalty angle. If she resists, escalate." The file ended. Silence. Karoline sat motionless, not from fear, but from focus. She removed her headphones. The chill in the room had nothing to do with the thermostat. She closed the file, encrypted it into a private drive, and backed up a second copy onto a secure flash tucked inside her wallet. If this was true, and there was no reason to believe it wasn't, then Milley wasn't just issuing veiled threats anymore. He was actively moving to restrict oversight, to shut her out of a project that had clear constitutional implications. And now, someone inside his network had leaked it. That part mattered. Not everyone in the machine agreed with what was happening, and someone, whoever they were, wanted her to fight back. She stared at the ceiling for a long second, letting the adrenaline level out. Then she stood, packed up her laptop, and stepped out into the chill DC night. Her heels echoed against the stone corridor. Outside, the city was silent, still unaware of what had just changed. Karoline wasn't ready to make it public, not yet, but she wasn't going to walk away either. If Milley was trying to bury Project Sandgate, then she would be the one to dig it up. By morning, the pressure inside Karoline's chest had hardened into something else: conviction. She'd spent the night replaying the audio clip, cataloging every phrase, every pause, every shift in tone. She wasn't just holding a threat. She was holding a strategy and insider plan to discredit, silence, and erase her from the conversation. And it was time to go public. But this wasn't a briefing room. This needed a stage big enough to match the scale of what she was about to say. So she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used since the midterms: Savannah DeWitt, of Fox News, a rising anchor with a reputation for fearlessly taking on both sides of the aisle. "Savannah," Karoline said the moment the call connected. "How do you feel about live airtime, no scripts, and national fallout?" There was a short laugh on the other end. "I feel like you've got something dangerous and I want it. An hour later, Karoline was en route to Fox HQ in Midtown Manhattan. The motorcade was minimal, no press tags, no official announcement. This wasn't government business. This was personal. Inside the studio, producers buzzed like hornets, cables were being run, chirons were triple-checked, and the senior editor paced near the control room, headset in hand. "This could get legal," someone muttered. "That's fine," Savannah replied. "Just make sure it's live." Back in Washington, General Milley's office released a formal statement to every major outlet. General Mark Milley categorically denies issuing any warning or directive to Miss Leavitt regarding classified operations. He urges the public to resist inflammatory media stunts and to trust in the integrity of our military institutions. Karoline read it backstage and smirked. It was textbook damage control: deny, dismiss, deflect. But Milley didn't know what she had. She walked into the studio carrying a black leather folder. Inside, 3 documents, each stamped internal NSC restricted. One outlined foreign coordination without presidential notification, another detailed communications with Scandinavian defense units. The third contained Milley's handwritten annotation: proceed with Oslo Loop, POTUS not advised yet. As the countdown to airtime began, Savannah leaned in from her chair. "You're sure about this?" Karoline didn't blink. "I've never been more sure of anything." The red light came on, and America leaned in. "Good evening," Savannah began. "Tonight, we're joined by White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, who has requested this appearance to address recent internal conflicts between the executive branch and military command. Karoline, the floor is yours." Karoline nodded, eyes fixed on the camera. "I wasn't planning to go public this week, but then I received a voicemail from General Mark Milley. And when someone who once oversaw every U.S. military operation warns you to stay in your lane, you either obey or you speak louder." She reached into her folder and lifted the first document. This is an internal memo signed by General Milley, referencing an active military liaison with NATO command in Oslo and Warsaw. None of these communications went through the President or the National Security Council. Savannah sat back in her chair. "You're saying Milley bypassed the chain of command?" "I'm saying," Karoline replied, "he acted like commander-in-chief." The screen behind them lit up with a visual of the memo's top page, Milley's signature clearly visible. In homes across America, jaws dropped. In Washington, aides scrambled. Then Karoline reached for her phone. "I'd like to play something," she said, "because Milley claims this is all fiction, but here's what he said to me, word for word." She tapped the screen, and the voice echoed across the country. "Miss Leavitt, this is not a playground. Stay in your lane or we make it very hard for you to stay in any lane at all." Gasps filled the control room. Savannah's lips parted slightly. The truth was out and there was no putting it back. "That's crystal clear." Karoline didn't flinch. "They call it integrity, I call it intimidation," and just like that, Karoline Milley exploded across social media. X lit up like wildfire. Journalists quoted every word. Politicians went silent. And somewhere in a darkened wing of the Pentagon, a former general realized this wasn't just a press secretary with something to say. This was a national reckoning. The segment hadn't even ended when phones across Capitol Hill began lighting up. By the time Karoline stepped off the Fox set and into the cold Manhattan air, Washington was on fire. Inside the Capitol, stunned aides forwarded clips, transcripts, and screenshots with subject lines like, "Did you see this?" and "Is this real?" It wasn't a partisan divide anymore. It was a full-blown constitutional alarm. Within hours, Representative Clayton Brooks of Texas stood outside his office and faced a wall of reporters. No notes, no teleprompter. If a retired four-star general told a sitting White House official to stay in her lane, he said, and that lane was the Constitution, then we've got a serious problem. I don't care what party you're in. That voicemail wasn't subtle. It was strategic. Just 2 floors above, Representative Irene Mallister, a Democrat from Colorado, issued a rare joint statement. "While I have disagreed with Miss Leavitt in the past, this goes beyond politics. The questions she's raised deserve real answers, and Congress must act accordingly." By 10 a.m., a bipartisan letter circulated demanding an emergency oversight hearing. But the story wasn't done evolving. That afternoon, while Karoline reviewed security protocols with her chief of staff, a secure tip reached her encrypted inbox. The subject line read, something they didn't delete in time. Attached was a Pentagon internal strategy memo titled "Post-Presidential Influence Channels." stamped internal not for distribution. It outlined plans to track and evaluate emerging political figures under 35 for narrative destabilization potential. Highlighted in red, strategic surveillance may be necessary in cases of sustained disruption to interagency cohesion, particularly from press-affiliated youth figures. Karoline's breath caught. It wasn't just about her. It was a framework built by military strategists for containing civilian voices. And now it was in her hands. She didn't hesitate. She posted the memo directly to her verified X account with a single caption. They said I was lying. I say, read it yourself. Within minutes, the post exploded. Hashtag contain this double quotes began trending globally. Commentators from across the spectrum chimed in, independents, libertarians, even former critics. And then came the unexpected domino. CNN, under pressure from internal legal teams, initially refused to air the voicemail. But someone inside their newsroom disagreed. At 3:40 p.m., an anonymous staffer leaked the full audio clip to an independent outlet, which published it under the headline, "You were never supposed to hear this." Less than an hour later, the clip aired on live television, CNN reluctantly, confirming its authenticity. Karoline wasn't watching when it happened. She was sitting quietly in her office, staring at her silver cross laid beside the leaked memo. When a knock sounded, her assistant leaned in. "Ma'am, the president's senior advisor is on the line, and so is Dennis and someone from Tulsi's team." She didn't move right away. The gravity of what had just been revealed wasn't something you celebrated. It was something you carried. Across the city, protesters gathered outside the Capitol, some holding flags, others signs that read the Constitution doesn't expire and no rank above the law. Even former President Trump weighed in that evening with a blunt statement on Truth Social. Karoline didn't just stand up. She stood alone and made them listen. But Milley wasn't backing down. His office released a second statement, this one sharper, colder. General Milley reiterates that he has not authorized any surveillance directives targeting civilians. Any suggestion otherwise is unfounded and politically motivated. But it was too late. The documents were public. The voicemail was real. And Karoline had become something the system wasn't ready for. Undeniable. In just 48 hours, she had shifted the national conversation from partisan noise to foundational accountability, not by yelling, not by accusing, but by holding up receipts. Suddenly, even those who once dismissed her as too young or too ambitious had no choice but to pay attention. Because truth, when spoken calmly and shown clearly, travels further than fear ever could. The building buzzed before she even stepped inside. From the Capitol steps to the marble corridors of the Hart Senate office building, the energy was unmistakable, tight, electric, expectant. Staffers whispered behind folders. Reporters clutched notepads, eyes wide behind camera lenses. Senators adjusted their ties and checked their expressions. And then she appeared. Karoline Leavitt, dressed in a tailored navy suit, stepped through the entrance with no entourage. No dramatics, just a single white folder tucked under one arm, and the glint of a silver cross at her collarbone, catching the overhead lights inside the chamber. The committee was already seated, a mix of Republicans and Democrats. Civilian analysts and military observers filled the semicircle before her. The gallery above was packed. Even a few Pentagon officials sat quietly in the back row, uninvited but undeniably watching. At the far end of the room sat General Mark Milley, stone-faced. He was no longer surrounded by uniformed aides or protected by title alone. Today, he sat as a witness, or maybe as the accused. Karoline took her seat at the center table. She didn't fumble. She didn't stall. She looked up, steady and unshaken. When a four-star general calls a sitting press secretary and says, "Stay in your lane," most people would take that as a warning. She began, voice even. But I took it as a sign that maybe the lane I was in was exactly the one I needed to be. A ripple passed through the room. She opened the folder and pulled out the first document, placing it gently on the table. A staff assistant passed copies to the senators. This is a summary of a closed-door briefing that took place in Brussels 6 months ago. Present were select NATO officials to civilian consultants and General Milley. She slid forward. The next document. This is the itinerary and air manifest. Milley traveled under civilian clearance without a directive from the White House or NSC signoff. Her fingers moved with precision, no hesitation, no performance here. She continued, pointing to a third sheet. This is the meeting transcript, page 4, second paragraph. Milley states, and I quote, We'll update Washington once alignment is reached. Until then, this stays between us. Gasps, audible gasps across the semicircle. Senator. Brooks leaned forward, lips pressed into a hard line. Karoline wasn't done. I've been accused of dramatizing, of being reckless, of misunderstanding military protocol. She paused and looked directly at Milley. I've read the manuals, General. I've studied the hierarchy, and nowhere in that chain does it say that a retired officer can act as if elected by the people. Milley's jaw moved slightly, but no words came. That's when Representative Irene Mallister, seated as a guest observer, cleared her throat. The room turned to her, a Democrat who had once openly criticized Karoline's youth and outspokenness. But now, her voice was calm. This isn't partisan, Mallister said. This is constitutional. Silence stretched. Then Karoline spoke again. I didn't come here to attack. I came here because I believe in what this institution represents, and because I believe that when civilians are being targeted, not for their actions, but for their influence, that's not defense. That's control. She placed the final sheet flat on the table, the Post-Presidential Influence Channel's memo. This was signed under Milley's watch. It outlined surveillance and strategic narrative control targeting individuals under 35 in political positions, specifically naming press-facing figures as potential disruptors. The room shifted, not physically, but perceptibly. Even the gallery hushed. She looked up, not at the committee, but at the nation watching through Live, BROADCASTS, and viral streams. No one is above the law, not a president, not a senator, and certainly not a general. Milley said nothing. Behind him, one aide closed a notebook slowly, as if the pages no longer needed to be written. Karoline stood. She didn't deliver a final dramatic line. She didn't raise her voice or pound the table. She simply closed her folder, nodded once to the committee, and walked out. The cross around her neck caught the light again, and in that moment, it wasn't just a symbol of faith. It was a symbol of something rarer in Washington: conviction. It didn't take long. Less than 48 hours after Karoline stepped out of that Senate hearing room, another leak made its way to the surface. Only this time, it didn't come from a whistleblower. It came from deep inside the Department of Defense. The file was stamped for internal strategic review only. At Board General Milley's digital signature in the header, its title read like something out of a spy thriller: Domestic Stabilization and Narrative Risk Monitoring, Post-Electoral Phase 2. But this wasn't fiction. It was a real-time playbook. One section, highlighted in red, contained a phrase that sent a chill through every journalist and constitutional lawyer who read it. Monitoring strategies shall be activated in cases where civilian-facing speech significantly disrupts perceived post-election stability. Particular attention to be paid to figures with high engagement among voters under 35. Narrative suppression may be considered in cases of sustained disruption. There it was in writing. A roadmap not for national defense, but for message control. And Milley had signed off on it. When the leak broke, cable news froze. Networks scrambled to verify. But the document was already authenticated by 3 independent analysts. By noon, the memo made front-page headlines. By sunset, and Karoline? She said nothing, at least. Not yet. She waited, calmly, precisely, the way she always did when the moment truly mattered. Then came the invitation, a live sit-down interview on 60 Minutes. No script, no advanced questions, just her, a chair, and a nation watching. She arrived alone, no team, no press secretary, no talking points. Just the same white folder she carried into the Capitol, and the silver cross still pinned just beneath her collar. The lights in the studio dimmed. The opening credits rolled. And when the camera turned to her, Karoline looked straight ahead and spoke with quiet fire. They said I was reckless, she began. I say I was right. She placed the folder gently on the table and opened it, not for dramatic effect, but for clarity. This wasn't about a personal grudge or a political headline. This was about the people who were never supposed to know what was happening. Behind closed doors, she turned to the interviewer. General Milley believed he was doing what was necessary to protect stability. But our stability doesn't come from secrecy. It comes from transparency, and no military directive, no matter how well-intended, has the right to monitor civilian speech, ever. The camera held on her face, calm, unyielding, certain. We cannot let the military forget who they serve. That line would become the most replayed soundbite in 60 Minutes history. The next day, newsrooms across the country echoed with questions that had once been considered dangerous. To ask out loud, who really calls the shots? How much power do unelected leaders hold? And what happens when one young woman challenges it head-on? Outside the Capitol that evening, the crowd had returned not with chants or rage, but with something quieter. Signs that red truth doesn't need rank, the Constitution has no chain of command, and we stand with Karoline. And then came the image that would be printed on magazine covers, made into posters, and screen captured into history. Karoline stood alone on the steps of the Capitol. Sunlight struck the white granite, bathing her in gold. She wasn't flanked by security or flattered by cameras. She wasn't giving a speech or answering questions. She was simply standing still, folder still in her left hand, cross glinting, softly at her collar, head held high. It was a photo that needed no caption because it didn't show a press secretary. It showed a citizen, one who refused to be silenced, one who reminded the nation of something it had almost forgotten. That truth doesn't need permission. That authority must answer to the people. And that's sometimes, just sometimes, the most powerful force in the room is the one voice that refuses to back down. Sometimes the loudest courage comes from the calmest voice. Karoline didn't raise her tone. She raised the truth. And now, the question isn't just about her story, it's about all of us. What would you do when power knocks at your door and tells you to be quiet? If this story moved you, challenged you, or simply made you think, tell us how. Drop a comment below. Let your voice join the conversation. And thank you, truly, for being here, because stories like this only matter if they're heard.